Today's story has a very surprising ending. And I do sort of tip off what actually happens, early-ish on in the story, but I'd be very surprised if people actually picked up on it and put it together before I reveal what actually happened. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a nice fresh bowl of oatmeal. Except, don't use milk, use glue. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the evening of June 12, 2012, a 25-year-old woman named Noemi Belanger opened up the door to her hotel room on Phi Phi Island, which is a major tourist destination in Thailand. Once the door was unlocked, Noemi pushed it open and she held it for her little sister, 20-year-old Audrey, who came in wheeling all their suitcases. Noemi and Audrey were both from Quebec, Canada, and they were also both college students, and they were on this big month-long vacation to celebrate the end of the school year. They had been in Vietnam for the past 3 weeks, and today they had arrived in Thailand, and their plan was to stay here for a bit before finally heading back to Quebec. But for right now, Noemi in particular was feeling really exhausted. I mean, there was a lot of travel getting here today, and the past 3 weeks had been loads of travel, and Noemi was kind of hitting a wall. And so as soon as she got into the room, all she really wanted to do was just flop down on the bed and just lay there for a little while. But she had also become a fairly experienced traveler by this point, and she knew before she did that, she just wanted to make sure that, the bed was cleanly, make sure there were no bed bugs or, unclean sheets or something. And so she went over and pulled the sheets back and checked, and the sheets were pristine. It was beautiful. The room felt super nice. And so she just flopped down on the bed and just enjoyed the air conditioning. And at the same time that she was doing this, Audrey, who very likely was also feeling all the, the symptoms of travel over so many weeks. I mean, she likely was very, very tired. But she, instead of laying down, went right into the bathroom and started getting ready for the night. And Noemi sort of understood why. So while the girls were in Vietnam, they had met these two really nice guys who were from Brazil, and they had kind of hit it off. And, they had left today to go to Thailand, and wouldn't you know it, it turned out those guys, their itinerary included them coming to Thailand today. And so it was kind of like this revelation at the end of their time in Vietnam that they would not have to say goodbye basically forever, but instead, the good times could keep on rolling in Thailand. And so the plan was that night they would meet up with these two guys, these Brazilian guys out on the beach, and basically party with them and just have a fun night. Now, Noemi was looking forward to this night out with these two guys, but she also had a little bit of apprehension about it. I mean, these guys were perfectly nice, and she and her sister had spent time with them in Vietnam, and really things had been fine. But, Noemi felt like Audrey was a little bit more naive and sort of like easier to be taken advantage of than she was. I mean, she was younger than her by 5 years, and also when the sisters had gone on this trip, their parents had been really apprehensive about, two young women traveling alone together all over the world. I mean, they were sort of vulnerable. And so the way Noemi had sort of played it to her parents is, don't worry, I'm the big sister. I'll keep my eye on Audrey, she'll be fine. And Audrey kind of played the role of younger sister and was like, yep, I'll do what my big sister says. And so Noemi sort of felt like she had a responsibility to keep Audrey safe. And so she was feeling a bit apprehensive about whatever they were gonna do that night with these guys. It just sort of seemed like things were sort of moving quickly with these two guys, They should have maybe just stopped in Vietnam, but they're here, and so who knows what was gonna happen. And so Noemi, as she's laying there and Audrey's getting ready, Noemi decides to just give her parents a call. Because one of the things Noemi had been doing over the past several weeks they'd been on this big vacation is sort of constantly updating her parents to assuage their concerns that anything was wrong, with their two kids. Noemi wanted her parents to see that she was doing everything she could, to keep her and her sister safe. And so she pulled out her phone and she was about to call her parents when suddenly Audrey appeared from the bathroom and said, stop. And she told her, like, hey, remember, it's evening for us, but back home in Canada, it's the middle of the night, so you're gonna be waking them up, and they're gonna have loads of questions, like, why are you calling in the middle of the night? And probably you're gonna have to tell them about, how we're going out tonight with these two guys, and they're gonna worry, like, Don't do that. Spare them. We will talk to them tomorrow. They don't need to know what we're doing tonight. Everything is fine. And Noemi was thinking, you know what? She's right. This is a bad time to call. Noemi actually forgot, the time change was so significant. And she also, wasn't sure what she would say to her parents about, going out with these two guys because it would raise some red flags. And so Noemi put her phone down and decided, you know what? Tonight's gonna be just fine. I just gotta let things go. And so she actually climbed off the bed and she joined her sister in the bathroom and began also getting ready for their big night out. A little bit later, Noemi and Audrey left their hotel room and they headed out to the beach. And sure enough, there, right outside of a beachfront bar, were the two Brazilian guys they were meeting up with that night. And as the two girls approached, they saw that each of these guys were holding these big buckets. They almost looked like, a toy that a child would use on the sand, to fill it up and make a sandcastle with, like a big, beach bucket. And, the girls, as they're walking over, they're wondering what these buckets were for, and they thought it was maybe like some joke these guys were gonna play, or they didn't know what. But as they got closer, they realized that these buckets these guys were holding were filled to the brim with ice and liquid. There was some sort of drink in these buckets. And so the girls walked up to them and they said hello, and very quickly, the conversation turned to these big drinks they were holding. And Noemi and Audrey were like, what are those? And the guys told them, these are like these amazing cocktails that you can only get in this part of the world. The girls asked, well, what is it? What's inside of the drink? What makes it so special? And the guys kind of looked at each other and laughed, and they're like, I don't know, just try it. It's really good. It'll make you feel great. Now, Noemi, being the sort of more responsible one, did not immediately begin drinking either of these drinks. Instead, she sort of paused and thought about it, but Audrey, on the other hand, was totally sold. She reached forward, grabbed one of the buckets, and just began chugging this drink. And so Noemi's looking at her like, come on, you can't just jump into this. We don't know what this stuff is. But, after a couple of chugs, Audrey lowered the bucket and looked at her sister, and she just grinned, and she handed it back to her guy, and then she told Noemi, these taste great. This is awesome. You gotta try it. Loosen up. And so at this point, Noemi, she's considering the situation. They were in Vietnam with these guys, and these guys were out partying with them. They were drinking with them, and, they seemed perfectly trustworthy, and they were clearly drinking from these buckets, and it didn't seem nefarious. And also, Noemi looked around the beach and suddenly realized that basically everybody had these big buckets. This was not just these two guys. Everybody's drinking this thing. And so Noemi's thinking, okay, well, if they think it's okay and it's sort of normal, in this part of the world, then it's gotta be okay. And so she reached forward, grabbed the other bucket from the other guy, and took a big sip. Several hours later, well after the sun had gone down, Audrey and Noemi were having a great time with their Brazilian friends. They were still near this beachfront bar. They were actually dancing right outside of it because now there was a DJ blaring some music and there were all these people. And actually the sisters had sort of broken up and were sort of doing their own thing with their respective guy, but they were sort of near enough each other that they could kind of keep tabs on each other. And they were just having a great time. By this point, they had jumped in the ocean and gone swimming. They had eaten a ton of local food. And Noemi had lost count of how many of these big bucket drinks they had all consumed together. But they were really just having a blast. Noemi's vision was a bit blurry and she was kind of stumbling, and she'd look over at Audrey and she was kind of in the same state, as were the two guys they were with. They're buzzed, they're having a great time. And so the two girls and their guys are just out there dancing, doing their thing. It's about 1 a.m. at this point. And Noemi's guy says to her, hey, do you want to head back to the hotel room together? And Noemi's like, yeah, let's go back. But hold on, I want to talk to my sister first. And so Noemi kind of stumbles her way over to Audrey, who's in the middle of this big dance routine with her guy. And she stops Audrey and she whips around, and Audrey's all smiles too. And Noemi's like, hey, do you want to go back to the hotel room? We're going back now. Do you want to come? And Audrey's like, no, I want to stay here. I'm having too much fun. This is awesome. We're just going to keep on dancing. You guys should stay too. But Noemi was like, no, I got to go. We're going to go back. So you sure you want to stay? And Audrey was like, yeah, we'll stay. We'll see you at the hotel soon. Now, typically, Noemi and her sister really rarely separated, especially when they were out drinking and partying, because of all the inherent risks of being alone at night, potentially intoxicated. And so, this was kind of a rare thing for her to break away from her sister and separate. But it just seemed like this was okay. It was safe. And, these guys they were with, they really seemed like stand-up guys. And again, they were just having a blast here, and Noemi didn't really want to stop her from having a good time. And so ultimately, she did say bye to her sister and said she'd see her soon. Noemi turned, and with her guy, she headed back to the hotel, and Audrey kept on dancing with her guy in front of the beach bar. Hey guys, just want to remind you that year-round we have amazing Mr. Ballin merch available all the time. It does not sell out. It's called Ballin Basics. You can get it at shopmrballin.com. These are different than the unique drops we do periodically. Ballin Basics, again, available 24/7, are things like our skeleton hoodie and t-shirt, our flannel blanket, all the stickers we have. There's a bunch of cool stuff, and it's available right now at shopmrballin.com. All year, you can get this stuff, some great stuff. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you don't gotta wait for the seasonal drops. You can go right now and get anything you want at shopmrballin.com. Year-round, it's available. Ballin Basics, check it out. 3 days later, on the evening of June 15th, a member of the housekeeping staff at the hotel where Noemi and Audrey were staying walked up to the girls' room and they knocked. And like it had been the past 2 days, they didn't get a response because over the past couple of days, the housekeeping staff had not seen anybody come in or out of this room. And now it had gotten to the point where they really had to get in there to clean the room, and basically, if they didn't get a response, this staff member was gonna have to unlock the door and just go in there. And so one more time, they knocked on the door and called out, housekeeping, just in case somebody was in there. But again, there was silence. So the staff member put their card into the door, they unlocked it, they opened it up and stepped inside. And seconds later, that staff member was literally running out of the hotel room, screaming for help. At 9 p.m. that night, a team of police officers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Rat Somboon, arrived at the hotel room. Somboon was an experienced police officer, and he'd already been briefed on what was found inside the hotel room. So when he and his team walked inside and saw it for themselves, he wasn't shocked. When they got in there, they found 2 women inside. It was Noemi and Audrey Belanger. And both of them were lying in their respective beds, tucked up in their sheets, lying perfectly still, and each of them was completely surrounded by vomit. Somboon estimated that these 2 women had been dead for between 12 and 20 hours, and his first theory as to what might have killed them was alcohol poisoning. That would explain the vomit. This was also a big tourist destination, and clearly these people were tourists, and so maybe they were out partying and they died from alcohol poisoning. However, when Somboon looked more closely at the bodies, he noticed a confounding detail. There was all this dried blood on the girls' gums and also under their fingernails. And so that was not consistent with alcohol poisoning. And so Somboon thought, okay, well, maybe the reason they have blood in these parts of their body is because those are defensive injuries. Maybe somebody attacked these girls and that's how they've been killed. But after doing a cursory check around the hotel room, there was no sign of a struggle or any sort of break-in or anything like that. And so, if there had been some sort of lethal struggle in here, it certainly didn't show. And so Somboon and his team really didn't have any idea what had happened here. They had some ideas, but clearly they needed more information. Specifically, they needed to do an autopsy and a full toxicology report on both women. That would be the only way to really see what happened here. But that would take time. And so while they waited for those results to come in, Somboon decided that what he would focus on instead is trying to figure out what these girls were doing in the hours before they died. Where were they? What did they eat? What did they drink? And who were they with? Over the next couple of days, Somboon and his team interviewed several of the hotel staff. And from those interviews, they learned that Audrey and Noemi were visiting Thailand from Canada. And on the first night they were here, the 2 women went out early in the evening, and then one of them came back with some guy, some unidentified man, at 1 a.m. They came back to the hotel. And then at 4 a.m., the other girl came back to the hotel, also with an unidentified man. And so there are Noemi and Audrey and these 2 unidentified men that are in the hotel room, presumably, from 4 a.m. until 6 a.m., when both of these unidentified men left the hotel room together, and the 2 girls were presumably left inside the hotel room. Lieutenant Somboon reviewed some security footage from the hotel, which confirmed this entire timeline was correct, which meant Somboon really needed to speak to these 2 unidentified men because they clearly were the last ones to see these girls alive. And so the police department put out an announcement about Noemi and Audrey's deaths, as well as a public call for help in identifying these two unidentified men. And shortly after making this announcement, the police learned that these two men were Brazilian, and unfortunately, they had already left Thailand on their way back to Brazil. And so obviously Brazil is outside of his jurisdiction, and so he had to appeal to Interpol, which is an international police organization, and appeal to them to find these two Brazilian men and interview them. About a week later, Sombun finally got a call from Interpol. They had found these two men and they had interviewed them. And they told Sombun that when they informed these two guys that Noemi and Audrey had died, the two men seemed genuinely shocked. And then when they were asked, why were you so quickly on a flight out of Thailand back to Brazil? They said, no, there's nothing suspicious about it. We already had booked those tickets way in advance. We just got on the flight and left. There's nothing more to it. And so Interpol said they continued to press these guys and asked them, hey, you were the last ones who were with these girls before they died. Tell us about their condition. Tell us how you left them when you left the hotel at 6 a.m. And the two guys, they said, look, they did seem like maybe they were already hungover or sort of sick from, partying the night before. They definitely did seem a little bit down, but they were basically fine. However, Interpol said it was fairly interesting that the two men did admit that following, their night out with Noemi and Audrey, that the next 2 days, they were stuck in bed themselves, totally sick, vomiting, ill. They didn't know what from, but they said they were very, very sick following their encounter with these two girls. Sombun thanked the Interpol officer and then hung up. And even though Sombun couldn't help but feel still pretty suspicious of these two Brazilian guys, he now was thinking, okay, well, if they said they got really sick after, spending time with Noemi and Audrey, maybe what happened here is, all four of them got sick with something, some illness, and the guys survived it and the girls didn't. And so Sombun began to think of, what type of illnesses could they have contracted? And the first thing that Sombun began to think about that could have been an illness that all four of these tourists could have contracted was food poisoning. Tourists come to Thailand and try the local food, and sometimes it makes them really, really sick. In particular, there were two types of food in Thailand that were sort of notorious for giving tourists just the worst food poisoning. One of them was a particular type of mushroom, and another was blowfish. And these two items, if your body reacted badly enough to them, it could be lethal. However, when Sombun got back the autopsy reports and the toxicology reports, he realized his theory about food poisoning was definitely wrong. So it would turn out those drinks that the girls had with the guys in those big buckets, they were unique to Thailand. Those are not drinks that are served really anywhere else in the world. And that's because those drinks are just not safe. And for whatever reason, it sort of blossomed in Thailand and it's sort of an accepted thing, but when you hear the ingredients of what's in this drink, you'll understand why it's not like a sanctioned or more popular thing outside of this small part of the world. So there is no alcohol in these big buckets of liquid. Instead, it includes crushed up narcotics, it includes cough syrup and Coca-Cola, and in some cases, pesticide. In fact, specifically DEET, which is the main ingredient in mosquito repellent. And wouldn't you know it, in the reports that Sombun got back, he saw both of these girls clearly had ingested DEET, which again is a highly toxic chemical. However, despite learning this, even though this seemed to be clearly what happened here, this is a DEET poisoning case, Sombun's thinking to himself, how could this have happened? I mean, these drinks, which are called 4x100s, are pretty popular in Thailand, and people are not just turning up dead left and right. It's a dangerous drink, no doubt, but people do not die with any regularity from drinking it. And so Sombun thought, what must have happened here is whoever mixed this particular batch of 4x100s must have accidentally included too much DEET. And so that would explain how, the two girls died from DEET poisoning, too much DEET in their drinks, and that very likely the guys as well consumed the same batch, which had tons of DEET in it, but their bodies were able to withstand it and they survived it despite getting very, very sick. And so 9 days after the two girls had died, their bodies were sent from Thailand back to Canada, along with the Thai police's official findings that this was an accidental DEET poisoning. However, when Noemi and Audrey's remains arrived in Canada, they did not go straight to their family. Instead, they went to a leading coroner in Quebec whose name was René Roussel. So by this point, the girls' parents were obviously heartbroken, but more than that, they were furious. The way they found out about the deaths of their daughters was on the media. I mean, despite the fact that the police were immediately called when the girls were found dead, the Thai police did not get in touch with the family. They only got in touch after their investigation was done, and they're like, hey, by the way, your daughters are dead, and it was a DEET poisoning. It is what it is. Good luck. And so the parents felt like, are you kidding me? Like, you didn't loop us in at all? We're spending days trying to get in touch with our daughters, and you knew all along they were already dead? Like, so the parents have no faith, no trust in the Thai police, and then to find out, wait a minute, so they drank this drink that apparently is sold at this beach bar all the time, and oh yeah, it killed them, no big deal. What, there's no warnings at this beach bar about how dangerous this drink is? Shouldn't there be like a tourist warning or something? And also, it's kind of a lazy explanation that, well, you know, the two guys they were with drank the same poison, but they didn't die just 'cause, and our daughters did. Like, that doesn't add up either. This whole thing feels like laziness, you know, at best, or at worst, a cover-up. You know, maybe this looks really bad for Thailand that these tourists have died and it could have been prevented. And so the parents felt like, we can't just take their explanation at face value. Like, clearly something is going on here, something's wrong. And apparently the Canadian government felt the same way as the parents. You know, this case was all over the news, and they also felt like, wait a minute, guys, like, we haven't looked closely enough at this. What's really going on here? And so it was actually the Canadian government who told Rene Roussel to go ahead and do another autopsy on these girls' remains. Let's really see if it was DEET that killed them, or maybe if it was something else. And when Rene checked Noemi and Audrey's bodies, she did discover there was DEET in their system. However, not nearly enough to kill them. So while it seemed plainly obvious that yes, they must have consumed those 4x100 drinks, that couldn't have been the thing that actually killed them. However, Rene didn't find any other poisonous substances in these girls' bodies. Like, there wasn't another explanation. It just showed there was DEET, but that was basically it. And so Rene, she's thinking like, there's gotta be some explanation here. And so Rene really began to do some serious research into this whole case, and eventually she found something. And it horrified her, it horrified the family, it horrified the world. It would turn out, from Rene Roussel's additional research, Noemi and Audrey were far from the first tourists to die this way in Thailand. Between 2009 and 2015, at least 20 tourists have been found dead under very similar circumstances. Now, Rene believed that what must have happened here is all these people, including Noemi and Audrey, must have been poisoned, but the common denominator did not appear to be food or drink. It had to be something else that was poisoning them. Something that was damaging blood vessels that would account for the blood under the fingernails and the gums, but also metabolized so quickly that after death, this particular poison could not be detected. And Rene figured out she was correct. So when Noemi and Audrey first arrived in Thailand, they went to their hotel room, and one of the first things that Noemi did is she pulled back her sheets to check for bed bugs. You know, she wanted to make sure her bed was clean before she laid down and relaxed. And when she looked, it appeared clean. And it was because the sheets were clean. They had actually just been treated for bed bugs, so there were no bed bugs. However, the way this hotel and other hotels, not just in Thailand, but in other parts of the world, the way they were treating for bed bugs was by spraying the sheets with pesticide, specifically phosphine gas, which is highly toxic to bed bugs, so it gets rid of the bed bugs, but it's also highly toxic to people. For reference, it is illegal to do this. You're not allowed to spray sheets with pesticide. And so based on all the evidence, it's believed that what actually happened to Noemi, Audrey, and the two Brazilian men they were with is that they climbed into those beds on the night they came back, and the men were in there with them for some time, and all four of them were being exposed to this phosphine gas. It was going in through their skin, they were breathing it in, and they likely had no idea. And so they're getting sicker and sicker. And then finally, the two men, they get up out of the beds and they leave at 6 a.m. They've now been, totally contaminated by this poison, but not enough to kill them. So they go home, and over the next couple of days, they get really sick from their exposure to this gas. But Audrey and Noemi, they didn't leave their bed. They stayed in those beds all night. And unfortunately, as they laid there, their bodies continued soaking in all of this poison, and their bodies just could not handle it. And so it eventually killed them. But despite learning this, and despite the fact that clearly something illegal was done here, you cannot spray your bed sheets in a hotel with pesticide to get rid of the bed bugs. It's incredibly hazardous. You can't do it. Despite that, to this day, no one has been held accountable for these girls' deaths. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm gonna tell you 3 stories about places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to take the like button's car to the car wash. But before you actually take it inside, be sure you roll all their windows down. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Around 10 p.m. on September 9th, 1975, a 24-year-old man named Roger Baldwin and his coworker, 29-year-old Peter Holmes, frantically crawled on hands and knees as fast as they could down a hallway towards the door of their apartment. And the reason they were crawling and not standing and walking or running is because this was no ordinary apartment. This apartment was basically like a metal box with a bunch of interconnected metal tubes that was located 200 miles off the coast of Scotland, basically out in the middle of the ocean, and it was also underwater. And the reason for that is it was connected to an offshore oil rig. And oil rigs often need divers, like deep sea divers, to work on the rig down deep in the water. But if you know anything about underwater diving, especially deep underwater diving, is that it's not as simple as just throwing on some scuba tanks and going down into the water and doing your work and coming back up again. No, if you're working on an oil rig down at depth, like an underwater welder or anybody who does work for a while deep underwater, there's lots of risks associated with going from the surface down deep where there's really intense pressures and you're breathing in different mixed gases that can interact with your body in sort of very terrible ways. It's dangerous. That's the reality of it. Going down to depth and then coming back up again is a very dangerous process unless you know what you're doing. It's more efficient for owners of oil rigs to construct these pressurized apartments underwater for their deep sea divers to live in, so that when they go out to the rig, they only have to go down to depth once, live in the apartment, which imagine a cup that you just push down into water. There's like an air pocket, right? You push it deep into the water. They basically would swim up under into this apartment deep underwater, and they live there and dive back out of there, do their work, come back into their apartment, but their bodies never really leave the working depth until the end of their shift, whether it's weeks or months or however long they're out there, and then they only have to decompress one time. So in essence, you get to work, you go down deep, and you stay there effectively for a long time, and then when you're done working, you go back to the surface. And so that's why that apartment existed, and that's sort of the setup for these two guys. They've been living underwater. But at that moment, Roger and Peter were not thinking about their diving responsibilities. They were rushing down this metal tube hallway that led to their apartment because over the intercom, the folks on the surface, their supervisor, had communicated down to them that there was some sort of leak happening in the hallway. And so they basically had to rush into their apartment and seal the door behind them before the air basically vanished in the hallway and they suffocated. So they're crawling as fast as they can. They finally get to their apartment door. They open it up, they go inside, they shut it and they seal it. And now they're sitting there with their backs against the door, hoping that the leak was contained to the hallway. And they're looking up into the corner of their small metal room, their main living space where there's bunks and there's also the entrance down into the water, basically right in front of them. And there's this camera up in the corner of this room looking down at them. And they have no way to directly communicate with their supervisor on the surface, but they know their supervisor has access to that camera and he's looking at them on his monitor, and his black and white, monitor. And so they're looking up at this camera, hoping that their supervisor is watching them and is doing everything he needs to do to officially contain this leak. Basically, Roger and Peter, they can shut their door, but they can't fully seal it. The full seal comes when somebody on the surface, their supervisor, injects helium into their room, basically adds more pressure to their room, which then sucks the door fully sealed, and then they're safe. And so Roger and Peter, they're listening carefully for the sound of that injection of helium into the room, and eventually they hear it, and there's some creaking on the door, and it sounds very much like their door is fully sealed, and now they're safe. And so Roger and Peter, they step away from the door, they sort of look up at the camera and say thank you. And they're like, all right, I hope that leak out in the hallway is our only issue here. Now, it's worth pointing out that things like this, as terrifying as that would be, you're deep underwater and over the intercom, they're saying there's a leak. Like, that would be horrifying, but this is a really dangerous job. And unfortunately, leaks and other things like that just sort of happened. And so Roger and Peter were kind of accustomed to things like this happening. And they just had to, hope that the folks on the surface would do their best to, mitigate the problems and, keep them safe. At this point, though, Roger and Peter knew that, it didn't seem like there were any other emergencies here. Whatever leak was happening in the hallway, that could be dealt with. If they had to, they could actually just leave their apartment with their diving equipment on and make their way back up to the surface. Like, there were ways for them to get out of here. And they're thinking, okay, our room has been fully sealed off. We heard the helium be injected into the room. The door's shut behind us, like, we're good. And again, they can't directly communicate to the supervisor. The supervisor's not saying anything over the intercom. And so they think, okay, it's good for us to just take our stuff off and go to bed. And so that's what they do. They take off their diving equipment and they climb into their beds and they turn out the lights. At the same time they were climbing into bed, their supervisor up on the surface, a guy named Reed Arnold, who'd been talking to them over the intercom, he was sitting there looking at this big control panel with all these switches and gauges and monitors that controlled their underwater apartment. And unfortunately for him, even though it did seem like the leak in the hallway was relatively contained, although it still was leaking, he was also now noticing that there was another problem that he wasn't telling Roger and Peter about yet. And that was, apparently, the door to their apartment, despite them closing it clearly and him injecting helium into the room, following all the steps, it appeared like the door somehow did not fully seal, which meant there was a slow leak. And over time, if this wasn't fixed, the pressure would drop so severely in that room that that could be fatal for Roger and Peter. Like, this is an emergency, but it's sort of a slow one. And so Reed took a minute and kind of assessed the situation. And, the only thing he could do to try to close this door to fully seal it, let's say, is to inject more helium into Roger and Peter's room. Not enough to harm them, but just enough to further push that door closed. And so he did that. He injected a little bit more helium, and he's watching the gauge of their room, become even more pressurized. But the indicator that showed whether or not the door was sealed continued to show that it was not. And so as Reed is sitting there wondering what he's going to do next, he looked over at the monitor that was the live feed into the room, where he could actually watch Roger and Peter, that camera in the corner of the room. And he sees the two men are laying in their beds, but then sort of out of nowhere, they both get up, climb off their beds, and they hustle over to the door, the leaky door, and they start trying to open it. But from the feed, as he's looking at it, it seems very apparent that they can't get the door to open. It's like it's stuck. And Reed's thinking to himself, that doesn't make any sense. I have this indication light that says the door isn't sealed, so even if it was a challenge to open the door, it's not pressure sealed. They should be able to open it. So what is going on here? And so Reed, he's beginning to panic a little bit because he just doesn't understand what's happening here. And as he's watching Roger and Peter, they go from frantically trying to open this door to almost in unison stopping, turning around, walking over to their bunks, and then grabbing their mattresses, taking them off, and then Roger and Peter climbed on to their metal bed springs and began rolling around on the metal. Now, it's worth pointing out that there are some diving-related injuries, like from being at depth for too long, or hypercapnia, where you have too much CO2 in your system. There's a whole bunch of things that can basically mess with your mind. And so Reed's thinking, oh my goodness, something's happened that's given these guys some sort of diving-related injury. Like they're acting crazy. This must be a product of something wrong. They're breathing the wrong mixture of gas. Maybe there's too much helium. Maybe there's too much CO2. Like, I don't know what's going on, but there is an issue here that's messing with their brains. Like, that's the only explanation for why they could be doing something so bizarre. And so at this point, Reed decides all he can do is just continue to put more helium into that room to try to seal that door. Maybe there's some sort of toxic gas that's getting into their space that's causing them to hallucinate or go crazy or who knows what. And so he's just firing off this button, adding more and more helium into the room. And after doing this for several minutes and still watching on the monitor as Roger and Peter continue to do this weird writhing around on their bed frames, that was around the time that Reed really focused on his controls. Like, am I missing something? Is there some other indication on here that gives away what's going on here? And that's when he realized he had made a terrible mistake. It would turn out Reed had misread the control panel. There really had been a leak in the hallway, and he was right to tell Peter and Roger to rush into their apartment. But once they were inside the apartment and they shut the door, and then Reed injected helium into their room, he actually did seal that room off. There was no issue in their apartment. They were totally safe. There was no problem. He was just misreading the control panel. He thought when he saw this additional indication that, the apartment door had not sealed, that was indicative of a leak in their apartment. But no, the controls were really trying to tell him that, hey, there's still a leak in the hallway right outside of their apartment. And so basically, what Reed ended up doing by injecting more and more helium into the apartment where Roger and Peter were is he was creating a deadly pressure chamber. And the reason the men began acting the way they were is because the room was getting hotter and hotter and hotter from all this pressure. They could feel it, building inside of the space. And so they didn't know what was going on. They tried to get out, but they couldn't open the door because it was pressure sealed. And then they took their mattresses off their bed and began rolling around on the metal to try to cool down. But it was so intensely hot and it was so pressurized that you can imagine the chaos and panic these two men felt. Like, yeah, maybe theoretically they could have thrown on all their equipment and dove out of there, but you gotta remember this is happening abruptly and they're basically boiling alive. And so it's like full-blown fight or flight mode, and these men are just trying to cool down, but they can't. And so every time Reed injected more and more helium into that room, he was raising the pressure and therefore the temperature in that small space, and eventually he boiled Roger and Peter alive. In the end, the supervisor, Reed, did not actually face any criminal charges because, one, it was a genuine mistake, but two, the mistake was one that many people would have made. There was basically an issue with this control board that sort of presented problems in a sort of ambiguous way. And so it really wasn't Reed being negligent, it was just a flaw in the control panel. At 11:40 a.m. on November 29, 1986, a 36-year-old volunteer fire chief named Jack Schofstall parked his fire truck on a country road right next to this huge farm in rural Indiana. Jack was there with his assistant chief named Donald Schnitker. After parking, Jack looked down the road and he saw the owner of this farm, Jeffrey Wolf, was standing on the side of the road, waving to them and turning around and pointing back towards his property. And so Jack and Donald, they looked out the window out in the direction that Jeff was pointing, and they saw there was this huge storage building off in the distance that clearly was part of the farm, and there appeared to be this thin plume of smoke coming off the top of it. And so Jack and Donald hop out of the fire truck, they hustle over to Jeffrey, and the three of them jog across the property over to this building. And when they get there, again, it's very clear that something is burning inside of this building. But this storage building was packed to the brim with stuff. Like, there was no way to get into the storage building from the front. Really, the only way to actually look inside of this building to see what was burning is by climbing up this ladder that ran to the top of this, 80-foot tall building, where at the very top there was a window that looked down into the storage building. And so basically Jack and Jeff said they would climb the ladder up to the top. Donald, the assistant chief, he would stay on the ground, and Jack and Jeffrey would go up there, look inside, and see if they could actually figure out what was burning so they could make a decision about how to approach this, what equipment they might need and what to do. And so Jack and Jeff, they make their way up this ladder to the very top, they get to this window, and Jack, he looks inside, And again, it's very clear something is burning in here, but he can't tell where it's coming from. He sees smoke coming out right next to him, but it's just there's so much stuff inside of this building, you just can't tell where it's coming from. But Jeffrey clearly had placed this big piece of plywood on the very top of all the stuff inside of the storage building as sort of like a makeshift platform if you wanted to, I guess, walk inside of this building in the one area you could walk into. And so he turned to look at Jeffrey and he's like, yeah, you can stand on that. And so Jack climbed through the window. And so he gets on there and it's kind of like he's surfing, basically balancing on the top of all this stuff, at the very top of this massive building. And he's looking around, but now Jack has a better vantage point. He's sort of more in the center of this big building. And as he's looking around, he identifies where this fire is coming from. Now, this was not some enormous fire, but he really had no way to attempt to put it out without leaving the building, going back down, and getting more equipment. And so Jack, who's still standing on this piece of plywood, he pulls out his radio and he radios down to Donald, the assistant chief who's down on the ground, and he says, hey, we located the fire, we're gonna come back down, get our equipment, we'll come back up here, we'll put this thing out, we'll be good. But after Jack put the radio back on his belt and he turned to walk back across this plywood, back to the window and down the ladder, before he got off the plywood, there was this low rumbling sound that came from right underneath his feet. At the same time, Donald, who's back down on the ground and who's just received this radio call from his partner saying, hey, we're gonna leave right now and get our equipment and put this fire out. Donald, he's down there staring up at the exit, up at the top there where Jack and Jeffrey had gone. And so far, he hasn't seen either of them come out of this building. It's just been silence. Like he heard a little bit of a rumbling sound inside of this building and he didn't really know what it was, but no one's coming out of the building. And he's thinking how strange that is. Like Jack just said he was coming out to get his equipment. Where is he? And so Donald grabs his radio and begins repeatedly calling Jack to say, hey, where are you? You said you were coming out. Where are you guys? What's going on? But he didn't get an answer. And so really quickly, Donald realized there could be an emergency inside of this building. Like for all we know, the fire is way worse and they're trapped or who knows what's going on. But based on protocol, Donald couldn't just on his own go charging up the ladder and go right in there to, save the day because he has no idea what he's walking into. He needs to make sure that he calls for help, gets other people here, and then can help explain what's going on here instead of he himself going up there and potentially being another casualty. And so instead of climbing that ladder, Donald began calling for help. And very quickly, an entire fleet of additional firefighters and police officers and ambulances showed up. There's all these people descending on the farm. And really quickly, first responders climbed up that ladder. They looked inside of the building and they figured out what happened. So when Jack climbed through that window at the top of this building and he stood on top of that piece of plywood that Jeffrey had placed up there on top of all the stuff in the storage building, and he was standing there balancing himself as he's looking around for where this fire is, eventually that rumbling under his feet was all the stuff underneath the plywood shifting, and he sort of lost his balance, and Jack fell off the plywood into basically the sea of stuff inside the storage building. And Jeffrey, when he saw this happen, he had not fallen in, but he turned and basically tried to get in there and grab on to Jack to get him out. But he too inadvertently fell into what was inside of this building. And what was inside of this building was corn. This was an 80-foot tall grain silo packed to the brim with grain. And so that piece of plywood was resting on the surface of the grain. And so when Jack fell into the grain, it was like it swallowed him whole like quicksand. And then Jeffrey, in an attempt to save Jack, also fell in, got swallowed whole, and they disappeared and suffocated. It would ultimately take nearly 3 hours for bulldozers to basically break apart this building and sift through all the corn to finally locate Jack and Jeffrey. Hey guys, as many of you may already know, our newest graphic novel, Where Nightmares Live, is coming out this fall. And if you have not already pre-ordered a copy, well, I'm here to tell you, I have a special, unique, new way for you to get your hands on one of these things. This October, you'll find me at 3 different bookstores where we will be selling hand-signed copies of this beautiful book, and also you get to take a picture with this guy. If this sounds appealing to you, all you gotta do is buy a ticket. And your ticket includes a hand-signed copy of the book and the highly coveted picture with me. The stops I'll be making are in Brookline, Massachusetts, Jersey City, New Jersey, and the Big Apple, New York City. You can see the full details of locations, times, all that on screen somewhere here, or you can just go to book.ballinstudios.com, and there for sure, there is all the information and how to buy a ticket and all that, book.ballinstudios.com. Thank you all so much for the support, and I can't wait to see you all at one of those bookstores in October. At 2 a.m. on December 2nd, 1755, a 94-year-old man named Henry Hall slowly climbed a flight of stairs inside of a lighthouse that was located on this tiny island off the southwest coast of England. Even though Henry was in his 90s, he was still working as a lighthouse keeper out at this lighthouse. I mean, by the way, that is a very rugged job, especially in the late 1700s. I mean, if there's ever any emergency of any kind out on this island, there's virtually no communication back and forth to the mainland, and help can't really get out to you very easily. So you're kind of on your own. I mean, lighthouse keepers at the time were sort of viewed as these very rugged, sort of survivalist types. And here's Henry at 94 years old, still doing this job. But it was because he loved it. And in fact, even to this day, he remains on record the oldest active lighthouse keeper ever. On this particular night, the other two lighthouse keepers that were staying on this island with Henry and working with him, they were passed out drunk in their beds. They basically had drank the whole night away, and they were out for the count. But, Henry sort of expected this. It was his job that night to do the night shift, the worst shift, if you will, where all night, every 30 minutes, he had to, 1, stay sober, and 2, hike his way up to the very top of the lighthouse and make sure the lighthouse was still emitting light. And so that's what he was doing right now. He was heading up to the so-called lantern room at the very top of the spire, the actual lighthouse. And you gotta remember that this is in 1755, so this is before electricity. And so the light that was coming out of this lighthouse were literally a whole bunch of candles that were situated in this big chandelier that kind of hung down from the very top of the spire. And then above, where the candles are all resting in the chandelier, was this big dome that was the very top of the lighthouse. And the dome was lined with lead, and there was also lots of windows all around. And so the lead sort of reflected all the light and pushed all the light out all the windows. And so basically Henry's job, or any of these lighthouse keepers, when it was their turn to do this, they had to go up to the lantern room and make sure all the candles were lit. And if they weren't lit, relight them. That was basically it. Now, Henry had been checking on lighthouses for decades. Doing these every 30-minute checks of the candles was completely routine. And so Henry's making his way up, thinking nothing of it. Like, this is gonna be completely mundane. I'm gonna go up, check the lights, come back down. I'll do it again in 30 minutes, all night. That's all it's gonna be. Doesn't expect anything to happen. But on this night, at around 2 a.m., as he's making his way up the stairs, as he's right near the top of the stairs and he's about to turn the corner and see, this big chandelier, it's called a candelabra, and right as he's turning the corner, he starts to smell smoke. And then when he turns the corner, he's looking out at this, completely lit up chandelier, the candelabra, and he doesn't see where the smoke is coming from until he looks up at the lead dome that sort of sat right above all the candles and reflected the light. And this lead dome had been here for a long time. This was an old lighthouse, and he could see there was all this buildup of soot on the underside of this lead dome from the candles being so close to it. And clearly some of the soot that was caked on the underside of this dome was starting to smolder. It was not on fire yet, but it was starting to smolder, and some smoke was filling up the lantern room. And so for whatever reason, Henry decided the best thing for him to do was to open up a window, because all the windows were shut at this point, and he's thinking, get the smoke out. So he opens up a window, but when he does, it creates a vacuum effect, and all this air gets pulled into the lantern room, and oxygen, it sort of acts as an oxidizing agent for fire. It basically accelerates fire, and so oxygen is pulled up, and the dome just ignites into flames. Basically, Henry threw a lit match onto the dome. That's the equivalent of what he did. And so suddenly, Henry's staring at this wall of fire on the roof of this lighthouse, And also above the lead dome, the actual structure itself of the lighthouse was wood. And so Henry has no idea what to do. He knows this is obviously a massive emergency. And so as quick as he can, he turns and goes down the stairs, down into the bunk room where his two colleagues are, who are passed out drunk in their beds. And he's trying to shake them awake and tell them we have this huge fire, but they're so drunk that they don't wake up. And so Henry's on his own. He needs to do something about this. And so he gives up on his colleagues and he starts walking back up the stairs towards this fire, and he starts making his way up the stairs. But before he reaches the lantern room, right before, maybe 5-6 feet down below, still on the stairs, there was this outcropping, like a balcony that jutted outside of the actual lighthouse. And so he stepped out onto this balcony, and standing out here, now he's outside, he turned and could look up, and basically right in front of him is the roof, and it's on fire. It's like right in front of him. And out on this balcony were all these buckets that were out there to collect rainwater, because it rained a lot out here. And so there's all these buckets of water, and Henry decides all he can do is start lobbing this water up onto the roof to hopefully put this fire out. And so one by one, he's hauling these buckets of water and chucking the water up on the roof, and it's really not making a difference, and he's so tired and exhausted, and the heat from the flames is so intense. Like, he knows he's not making much of a difference here, but just then he hears his two colleagues come bounding up the stairs, and they're totally panicked, and even though they're drunk, it's clear they're kind of sobering up when they see the scene here, and so they instinctively run out on the balcony with Henry, and all three of them are now grabbing buckets, and they're looking up, and they're chucking the water up onto the roof, and Henry at one point sort of positioned himself a little bit closer to the edge, and was like right underneath the dome, throwing water up, and it didn't matter. It was like nothing they did could get this fire to go out. And then finally, Henry grabbed one last bucket, and with the last of his energy, he got right below the dome, sort of with his arms out in the balcony, and he looked up, and he chucked the water right onto the roof. And as he did, he suddenly felt this blinding pain come over his whole body, but somehow it sort of felt localized in his stomach, but definitely it was his whole body. And he turned and he looked over at his colleagues, like in shock, like he can't even believe, like, what's causing this pain? And his colleagues, they look at him and they see he's smoldering. There's smoke coming off of him. And so clearly he's on fire. And so they start taking their buckets and they're dousing Henry with water. And Henry's like, oh my God, I'm on fire. And he feels this horrible pain in his stomach. And finally he just blurts out to them, we gotta get out of here. Like, leave it, we gotta go. And so the three of them, they abandon the buckets, abandon the fire, and they bolt out of the lighthouse, and they make their way to a cave on the coast of this island. And there they stayed in this cave overnight as their lighthouse burned to the ground. And all night, Henry, even though now, the fire that had begun on his clothes, it had obviously been put out, but he still had this awful pain that really felt localized in his stomach. It was like this burning, awful pain, and he just couldn't figure out, like, what is that? Is it from being on fire? Was I not aware of how long I was on fire for? Is this just like the result of an extreme burn? Is this smoke inhalation? Like, he didn't know, but he was just happy to be alive. And finally, the sun came up the next morning, and these three men are huddled in this cave. And luckily there was a ship on the horizon that spotted this smoldering ruin of the lighthouse, and they came in, they scooped the three men up, and they brought them back to mainland England. Once they arrived in England, Henry's two younger co-workers made sure to help get Henry to his home, and then when he was there, they called for a doctor, because Henry was still complaining about this really intense feeling in his stomach, and just obviously the fire had really taken a toll on him. And so the doctor shows up, and they perform an examination on Henry, and they see that yes, you do have significant burns on your body. Clearly you were at one point on fire. And to Henry, he couldn't quite believe it, because his memory of the night was just throwing water up on the roof and being so frustrated, like he didn't even realize it, that at some point he'd been on fire. It was just all of a sudden he had this sudden blinding pain, and before long he had been doused with water, and that was it. But he still just had this awful pain in his stomach. And the doctor told him, like, look, I don't know exactly what that pain is from, but very likely when you were on fire / when you were right near the fire, you were inhaling a lot of smoke, and that can absolutely cause a really intense burning sensation in your lungs. And so just apply this ointment to your burns, take care of your burns, and eventually your burns will heal, and that feeling in your gut, like in your core from the smoke inhalation, will pass. And so for the next several days, Henry did as the doctor ordered. He applied his ointment to all of his burns, he rested and just drank lots of water and just basically waited for all these pains and ailments to go away. But over the coming days, he didn't get better. He got worse. Not only would that pain in his stomach just not go away, but also he developed a really bad fever, and then finally, 12 days after the fire, Henry died. Now, on one hand, Henry's death was really not shocking. I mean, he was 94 years old. You know, people die when they're in their mid-90s. It's sort of a natural thing. But at the same time, he was like a really active, rugged guy. And it just seemed like, how is it possible he's died from what appears to be sort of relatively superficial injuries here? I mean, he definitely got burned. He had real burns on his body, and he had clearly some smoke inhalation going on. But the doctor said, like, that shouldn't have been enough to kill him. He should have, weathered this and been okay. Maybe he did die from natural causes, but this just feels wrong. Like something else must have happened here. And so ultimately, the doctor decided to perform an autopsy on Henry. And at first, when the doctor began the autopsy, everything kind of checked out, that Henry did appear to, have just passed away, and, he's 94, it is what it is. Until he cut open Henry's stomach. When he saw what was in there, he was horrified. It would turn out, during the fire, when Henry was out on the balcony lobbing buckets of water onto the roof to try to put the fire out, well, at some point, right before he felt that burning sensation in his gut, he looked up as he was throwing the water and his mouth was open, and at the same time he did that, a piece of molten lead from the dome that was on fire dripped down and fell into his mouth, and he swallowed it. A 4-inch piece of molten lead landed in his gut, destroyed his stomach, and then cooled and hardened in his stomach. That was the pain he was feeling. And then he also caught on fire about at the same time. And so in the chaos of the moment, despite this blinding pain he's feeling in his stomach, everybody else is looking at him saying, oh my gosh, you're on fire. That's what the problem is. They douse him with water. And even after he's had the flames extinguished and he's complaining of this pain in his stomach, no one's thinking it can be anything other than the fact you were just recently on fire. That's gotta be it. Smoke inhalation, connected to your burns, whatever it is. No one's thinking it could be anything else. Today, that same piece of lead is actually on display at the National Museum of Scotland. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
আমি যদি কখনো কোনো ভুল করি আমাকে শুধরে নিও, দূরে সরিয়ে দিও না।
এত বছর ধরে যে ছেলেটাকে আমি চিনি, গোছানো দেখি, কোনো দরকার নেই। আপনি হেল্প করবেন না? আপনি ওর কাছে
হেল্প করি।
লাগবে না, আপনি ফ্রেশ আসুন, এটাই অনেক বড় হেল্প।
মা যখন এখানে থাকে না, তখন মায়ের শাড়িটা আমি রেখে দিই, মায়ের গন্ধ অনুভব করার জন্য। নাও।
আচ্ছা, ও না হয় ছেলে মানুষ, জ্ঞান গরিমা কিছু নাই, কিন্তু তুমি তো মেয়ে মানুষ। হ্যাঁ, এখন এই ফুল চুরি করার অপরাধে সকালে যদি আপনার জেল হয়,
জেল হলে। আসসালামু আলাইকুম আঙ্কেল, গুড মর্নিং।
ভেরি ভেরি ব্যাড মর্নিং।
কি বলেন? দুইটা বেরি তার বেকার ছেলে সংসার করতে যে কষ্ট হচ্ছে সেটা বললেই তো পারো।
সারাটা দিন আমাকে কথা শুনিয়ে শুনিয়ে কাজ করিয়েছে। আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে, আমার সংসার, আমার কাজ করতে কোনো সমস্যা নেই। নিজের ঘরে এরকম ফিসফিসিয়ে কথা বলছো কেন?
আরে মা কোথায়?
মা তো ঘুমাচ্ছে।
শিওর?
আপনি যে আমার ছোট ছোট বিষয়গুলোতে এত খেয়াল রাখেন, এতেই আমার ভালো লাগে।
তোমার জন্য একটা জিনিস আনছি।
কি জিনিস আনছস?
আপনি একটু চিন্তা করেন আপনার জন্য কি আনছি।
এই এত ছোট বাসায় তো তিনজনের হয়, কষ্ট হয় না থাকতে?
আচ্ছা বিয়ান সাহেব, আপনি কি আপনার মেয়েকে দেখতে এসছেন না কথা শোনাতে এসছেন?
মা, আজকে রান্নাটা কিন্তু দারুণ হয়েছে। অনেক দিন পর তোমার হাতে রান্না খেলাম। কোথা থেকে আসলে? কোথা থেকে আসলে? গত 7টা দিন তো দেখলাম, একটাবারও তোমার মুরদ হয়নি উপরে উঠে এসে কথা বলার, সরি বলার। আপনি প্লিজ এখান থেকে চলে যান, আপনি আমাদের মাঝে কথা বলবেন না।
তুমি বাড়াবাড়ি করছো।
বাড়াবাড়ি আমি করছি মানে?
তুমি কষ্ট পেয়েছো রাইট?
আমি মোটেও কষ্ট পাইনি, আমি বরং একটু অবাক হচ্ছি।
সব কিছু তো একদম সুন্দর মতো গুছিয়ে ফেলেছো। হ্যাঁ, একদম সংসারে হয়ে গেছে না?
আমি ন্যাকামি পছন্দ করি না, যা বলার সোজাসুজি বলো। এ কি?
আমি তো কিছু বলাই হয়নি।
আচ্ছা ওটা শুনবো আরেকদিন। তুমি একটু খাও, মাছ দিচ্ছি তোমাকে, নাও।
বাসাটা ছোট হলেও আমাদের তিনজনে থাকতে কোনো সমস্যা হয় না। কি হয়েছে মা, বলো তো? তুমি তো কখনো এভাবে কথা বলো না।
না মানে